You're training your hip flexors completely wrong. You're in the right place because in this video, I'm gonna show you how to train them correctly and get you real results. What's up guys, Dr. Nick Bonforte here to go all over how to train your hip flexors. Make sure you take a look down below in the description for timestamps so you can skip ahead to the exercises. If you wanna stay around for the explanation, then do it. But if you want just quick and easy exercises to get right to it, timestamps below, let's get to it. Now real quick, just give me a minute to explain what the hip flexors are and why we have to think about it a little bit differently to address these things. The hip flexors live on the front of the hip. The primary job of the hip flexors is to flex the hip or bring the knee closest to the chest. Now the thing is though, a lot of times we spend all day in shortened positions trying to rep out the hip flexors from a strengthening standpoint in a shortened position. We have to think about other components that contribute to this, such as glute strength, strengthening it on length, and then also strengthening it in a shortened position. So we have to take those concepts into it, and those exercises that I'm gonna show you will dive right into that. Let's get to it. So this exercise, we're working on hip flexor eccentrics. We'll have the quad components involved into this, but the concept of understanding what you should be doing with your body is key with this. I'm using some support to emphasize the intention with this exercise. So when you're using the support, you don't want to be holding on to it for dear life and de-emphasize what you're trying to work on. You want to think about keeping your pelvis forward. You're going to be squeezing your glutes to thrust your hip forward, and you maintain that position as you go down. And when you're going down, you're thinking of driving your hips forward as you go down. That will emphasize your quads working, and your quads go all the way up into your hips. So you're working on an elongation of these muscles, or eccentric. So with this, you want to be really intentioned with it by not using your upper body so much to support yourself as you're going down, but using your legs as the main force throughout this. So it's key to really focus on shooting your hip forward by squeezing your glutes, push your hips forward, maintain that position as you go down. The incorrect way is to just break at your hips and kind of do this rounding effect and also hold on for the support for too much. That's gonna be de-emphasizing what you're trying to bias here. Now, clearly, you can progress off of not using some support, but I'm using this because many times people go too fast, too quick, and they aren't doing the exercise as beneficial as they could. So by using some support, we could really get more intentioned with how you're actually doing it. With this exercise, I like reps here. So 3 sets or 4 sets of 12 to 15 to really get some good input to the quads and hip flexors. So with this exercise, we're working on eccentrically loading the hip flexors in the quad region. So when people think hip flexors, they think just the iliopsoas muscle. Well, hip flexors also go down to the quads. The rec fem muscle is a hip flexor muscle, and that goes and has all fascial connections into the hip flexor region. So we have to focus on thinking of lines of tissue that we want to elongate, and that's a big part of all of that line. So by using the eccentrics, we're targeting that area to ultimately get input into that whole front line, all that fascia in the front of your quad into the hip flexors to elongate. Now, it's kind of a 2-for-1 because we're working on eccentrics, which also works on strength, but it also works on the extendability of the actual tissue. Now, with this particular exercise, using support could definitely be helpful for here, but you want to progress yourself off of these things, but remember to focus on the form. Now, I'm doing it on 2 legs here where both my knees are down, but you could also bias where it's just 1 leg, where 1 knee is down, you're in a half kneeling position, and you perform the same concept. But here, to keep it as simple as possible, both knees down as you're doing it, so you could really emphasize the form and have the key to keep glute engagement as your hips are thrusting forward as you go down. Really a little bit more of a sciencey thing into that. One, from a reciprocal inhibition standpoint, when you squeeze your glutes really, really hard, in reality, it shuts off or reciprocally inhibits the hip flexors. So it really will emphasize the hip flexors to let go from a tightness perspective and allow you to go deeper and deeper into the stretch throughout it. So this is a really good one to perform, but you have to do it correctly. So make sure you go, if you're watching this, hopefully you took some actions on the exercise performance and you did it correctly. Super good one to really get strength and some extendability to this area. So with this stretch, we're doing a foot elevated on a bench, and we're gonna be stretching the hip flexors. So the leg that is down, it's in hip extension and behind me a little bit. That puts the hip on stretch, hip extension, the opposite of hip flexion. Now the thing is, you're gonna hold that stretch for a period of time. You wanna make sure you're squeezing your glutes and your abs, and you shift forward until you feel a nice stretch. For simplicity reasons, we're gonna hold the stretch for a period of time, then we're gonna perform a contraction where we squeeze our legs together for a period of time, and then you repeat that cycle. So when you're watching this, you're watching the stretch period period for a time. Imagine 30 seconds go by. Then after the stretch, you want to focus on squeezing your legs together where you'll feel your hip flexors and your groin working. You hold that squeeze together hard for a period of time. We'll hold it for 10 seconds. After that 10 seconds is done, then you relax and you go further into the stretch, and then you repeat the cycle again. You hold it for a stretch period, then you squeeze together, hold it for a contraction period, and then you repeat it again. You want to typically do about 4 rounds of this so that you get about 2 minutes of time under tension and some good input into the hip flexor region. In this one, we're in a stretch position. You still squeeze your glutes, you still squeeze your abs, and you shift forward until you feel a nice stretch into the quad and hip flexor area. Now, the key concept with this is we want to build isometric load through the box and then lift off. So we're going to be holding for a stretch period, building down for a period, and then lifting off for a period. So first, you're going to be in the stretch position, feeling the hip flexors and the quads being stretched. We'll hold it for 30 seconds. After that, you want to think about pushing your leg through the box and holding that contraction downward for a period of 10 seconds. After that 10 seconds is up, you want to then lift your heel towards your butt as hard as you can. You'll feel your hamstrings working. You might even cramp. You hold that for 10 seconds. Then after that, you bring your leg down and then you shift your weight forward into the stretch again and you repeat that cycle. So the cycle is you hold it for a stretch, you contract down, then you lift off, and then you repeat. Repeat about 4 rounds for that 2 minutes of duration under time. Now the thing with this is making sure form is right. Make sure you're up nice and tall, squeeze your glutes, squeeze your abs, shift your weight forward so that you get that nice stretch into the hip flexor area. So the idea behind these stretches is you're getting essentially 2 components here. The first stretch, when the foot is elevated and the leg is behind you, you're really trying to bias the hip flexors at the iliopsoas level. Why? Because the knee is straight. And when the knee is straight, the other muscles of the hip flexors, like the rec fem, is slacked. So we're trying to really just bias that upper part, or the iliopsoas muscle, because the hip is just in hip extension and we're biasing that leg. So the idea is to do it and perform it in that position. Now also the idea with performing contractions during the stretch is to help let the muscle kind of relax and melt away as you're doing it. Because a lot of times when we get more input into the muscle, it will reflexively relax it, versus if it's super tight, it's going to be guarding because it doesn't want to stretch. So when we get a little bit of contraction into it, it helps relax it, a PNF type of facilitation, and we are allowed to actually go further and further into the stretch position. And then when we're on the ground, the knee is bent. Now we're stretching more components or more things that are involved in the hip flexor. With the hip still in hip extension and the knee bent, we're actually stretching the rec fem, the psoas muscle, and all other hip flexors, because we're targeting 2 joints in this position. Now with this, we're also creating a contraction period when we push down, but then we're also working on the opposite side of the joint when we're trying to bring the heel towards the butt, and we're trying to use our hamstrings. Now the hamstrings will probably cramp, especially if you're not really adapted for those positions. And it's good because you want to train that body position to own it. And when you train your body to own different positions, your flexibility improves. So you want to make sure you're working on the opposite side of the joint, such as hamstrings in this case, to help ultimately stretch the hip flexors and the quad, the rec fem, and everything else on the front line of this tissue. So with this, we're doing a bridge, really trying to work on the end range strength of hip extension. Now, the idea is we're just going up on 2 to assist us into the motion, and then bringing one leg off and then holding that position for a period of time. So you'll see I'll try to make my thigh as parallel to the ground as possible by focusing on my glutes thrusting up to the sky as hard as I can. That will really emphasize activation to the glutes and really get some good input to this hip region. The idea with this is holding end range positions for a period of time. So you could hold it for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The idea is we're getting input into the system to work on hip extension, which is the opposite of hip flexion. With this, I like also more reps. So depending on how long you're gonna hold it for, 3 sets of 10 or 3 sets of 15, and you can manipulate how long you hold it to get that input that's gonna be challenged for you. So the idea behind the end range hip extension exercise is to really emphasize the opposite side of the joint of the hip flexors working. So the hip flexors bring the hip into hip flexion, or the leg into hip flexion. But we have to also control hip extension so that the hip flexors know how to work in a lengthened position. The only way it knows how to work in a lengthened position is to use the opposite side of the joint muscles to then teach the hip flexors how to work on length. So with a simple one like this, when we're in a bridge position, we're going up and really trying to work on form and control here. So with this, we're not pumping out just regular bridges, we're really focusing on using our glutes to thrust the hip up into hip extension and hold that end range position. I like input because the more time we get at an end range position, the more input we have. If we just come up into a bridge and come right back down, and come up and come right back down, we're only getting a split second of time under tension. There's not enough input. So as an example, say you did 3 sets of 10, and we'll call it, say, a 1 second hold. You're gonna get 10 seconds, three sets, that's only 30 seconds of input. And you do it once a week, that's 30 seconds of input of hip extension. How is that gonna make any change? You wanna make more input so that you can make change. So as an example, if you did 3 sets of 10 at 5-second holds, 5 seconds at 10 reps, that's almost close to a minute. You do 3 rounds, that's close to 3 minutes. You do that a couple times a week, that's much more input than just 30 seconds. So that's the idea behind holding more time under tension in this position. Well, there you go. I hope you did find some value in this video and gain some insight and perspective on how to address the hip flexors in a different way versus just strength training them in an end range position. We focused here on more of a lengthening position from an eccentric component. We focused on some stretches, and we also focused on the opposite side of the joint. Now, am I saying the end range positions of strengthening it is bad? Of course not. You should probably be also adding those in. These just emphasize a lot of the areas that get overlooked many times when it comes to the hip flexors. So hopefully you did gain some value in this and learn some stuff. If you did find value in it, I'd greatly appreciate it if you subscribe down to the channel below, leave any questions or comments down below, and I will see you on the next one.